Set on the water in Providence, Rhode Island, is a mansion with an interesting story. But getting there for a private Eaglemania show was not as easy as it looks. It's another episode of Life in the Fast Lane. I'm John Weisswasser, pilot and drummer for Eaglemania. Follow me as I explore the practical use of general aviation while I travel the country with the world's greatest tribute to the Eagles. This is Life in the Fast Lane. So, for this trip, I needed to get from Caldwell, New Jersey to Providence, Rhode Island for a private Eaglemania show for Feadship. With me on board were Ken and Frank, and we needed to be in position for a 4:30 in the afternoon sound check. For this 160-mile trip, I selected Quonset State because it was closer to our destination and a lot cheaper. The surface analysis that morning showed a big high-pressure ridge dominating the route. METARs were all VFR. Quonset wasn't reporting for some reason, but airports around it were all clear. To the west was a broken layer at 5,000 feet. The forecast was to remain that way, but this was a little deceptive. That layer at 5,000 feet to the west, the Graphical thunderstorm outlook gave a little more insight as to what that was. The ECF-TCF was not surprisingly not very revealing, and neither the icing or turbulence forecast had much to offer. NEXRAD just before I left showed some activity, but nothing insurmountable. So I filed for 1 o'clock and headed out to the airport.
I don't mind you coming here and wasting all my time. When you're standing oh so near, well I kinda lose my mind, yeah. And it's not the perfume that you wear, and it's not the ribbons in your hair. I don't mind you coming here and wasting all my time. One time.
I had a lot of technical problems with the GoPros on this trip. In fact, I almost decided to bail on editing it because I had so many failures with the video gear. But the flying was interesting enough and the show was unusual enough that I decided to try and piece this together because I think there's some really worthwhile nuggets in here. The audio adapter for the GoPros had a loose connection, and unfortunately I was unable to capture any audio for either leg of the trip, which is a bit of a bummer because I wasn't able to capture the interaction with ATC as we navigated our way up to Providence through a lot of the storms. So I'm really just going to narrate what was going on as the video unfolds. Also, it was really hot out, and the forward-facing camera kept overheating. This is a recurring problem in the Meridian in the summer especially, and I'm not sure how to remedy it other than wrapping the camera in tinfoil. Our clearance was exactly what I filed for, and there was relatively little delay in getting off the ground. But as we neared the first waypoint, Breezy intersection, which I believe happens to be the outbound gate to the north for New York approach, you could see stuff developing on the NEXRAD, and visually, the buildups were pretty clear to see when I wasn't in the clouds. As is usual for New York approach, they were keeping me low while I was in their airspace, but since I wasn't able to see the larger buildups, because I was in and out of IMC, I warmed up the radar and started asking for deviations. In this case, I decided to go to the north of the buildup that was between Breezy and Carmel, my second waypoint. Approach was very accommodating. My strategy with the Meridian is always to get as high as I can, so I can really see and maneuver around the buildups, even the ones without precipitation. Once they are above about 10,000 or maybe 15,000 feet, they get really turbulent, and if the temperature is below freezing, there's usually a lot of clear type icing, which is a big no-no. I also like using days like this to practice using the radar, the only tool in the cockpit that can be reliably used to navigate around convection. The good news about this flight was that the route predictably kept us well east of the storms, I'm sure due to the cooler air over the water, which tends to stabilize air. You could see a lot of the larger storms to the north and west, and shortly after we reached our cruising altitude, ATC started us down. Along with always filing IFR, even in VFR weather, a very wise and accomplished instructor I used to get trained in the Meridian, advised me to always fly the approach. His reasoning being that if you get in the habit of always loading and flying the approach, then when the weather is crummy and low, the mechanics of loading, configuring, and flying the approach will be routine and allow you the mental bandwidth to deal with the issues related to weather and planning. It's also helpful when going to an unfamiliar airport, and I found this to be a really, really good piece of advice and something that I do as a rule. So here you can see I loaded up and asked for, notice the order in which I did that, the RNAV to runway 16 at Quonset. As soon as he started giving me vectors, I activated the leg of the approach between the initial fix and the final approach fix because I felt it was pretty likely that that's where he was going to have me intercept the final. For me, it's all about anticipating what's next. You could see a storm building to the north and west. Fortunately, it really didn't have any effect on us.
As long as it was deep, yeah. And I always knew you very well. And you look so fancy, I could tell. And I don't mind you coming here and wasting all my time.
Since its inception in 2013, Eaglemania has always set out to be a theater band. We don't really do bars or clubs, and we've tailored our show to really match the theater audience. Our show really doesn't change much from night to night. I mean, occasionally we substitute out some of the B-sides for other ones just to mix it up and make it interesting. But by and large, the show is note for note the same. Even the jokes and the stage dialogue stays the same. The set list and the crisp transitions between songs is also exactly the same night to night. And you might think that playing the same show like that is boring, but it isn't. The challenge is to make it perfect, and perfection is a holy grail in this business. There's always something that I can look back on and wish that I had done differently, and that's what makes it interesting. The repetition is pretty much how we know if we had a good night. If the show was the typical delivery, then we succeeded in delivering a great show. In a lot of ways, it's like a monologue or a dramatic performance in that regard. So we are very sensitive to venue. Feadship, a Dutch company which makes massive, massive yachts and sells them to a worldwide market, asked us to play a party that they were throwing for their New England customers. The venue, in this case, the backyard of a huge mansion right on the water, and the audience, a group of 80 or so yacht owners, proved to be a unique setting for us. We had never played to such a small crowd in such a limited environment, and it was a refreshing break away from the usual seated theater show. So it's a little unusual for us.
It is kind of unusual because, we used to play in theaters, a couple thousand people, and, you got that whole dynamic, the whole crowd getting up and carrying on with you. There's that energy. This is going to be really intimate. This is going to be fewer than 100 people.
Right.
The good part of that is they're going to be laser focused on the band,
right,
even more than a big crowd. Right. And the better part of that is you can make a one-to-one connection with a lot of them because they're going to be right there,
right. The house itself had a really interesting history, and leave it to JD to totally figure that one out.
An American.
So the previous owner of this house was a sculptor, right? You got to tell the story.
This is basically a three-dimensional sketch that the sculptor used to figure out the Iwo Jima, the raising of the flag. This is it. This is the actual thing. These thumbprints in the clay are his thumbprints. He did this as a preliminary, and he refined it as he went along. As you can see, it's a different composition. His finished piece has the, very much like the photograph, where they're all striving and reaching together. But you've got the fallen soldier in the back. I mean, the expressions on their faces. This was his sketchbook.
So once I saw that in the basement, I started noticing them all over the house.
What are you going to do differently?
Not a whole lot.
No?
Not a whole lot. It's the same, it's the same songs. We're going to bring the same energy as we always bring, but it's going to be, I'm not even going to say throttled down. It's going to be channeled more to a smaller crowd. We're not, we're not grandstanding. We're not pointing up at the balcony.
Right.
We're not throwing stuff out to the lounge.
Are you going to ask for requests?
No.
So Dennis, this is a small crowd for us, right? This is not our usual.
No, it's intimate.
What are you going to do different?
Well, I was thinking about having a sex change.
On stage?
On stage.
Just because it's such an intimate audience?
Yeah, you know. You know, there's Muffy and there's Biff. I could be both. Miff.
What are you going to do different tonight, given the size of the crowd?
I'm going to listen to the drummer for a change.
You ain't got no choice, man.
The next morning, I planned the return flight, and all I could say about the METARs was VFR. And with a mid-morning departure, the TAFs were no different. Here's a look at that graphically. There really was no significant weather to contend with at all, and no forecast icing or turbulence. So here's the thing. After the show in my hotel room, I went ahead and filed for the morning, and this was the expected route I got back. Crazy, right? And I knew from flying back to Caldwell from that general area that this was in fact what I would get for routing if I were to pick up a clearance and go IFR. On the other hand, if I went VFR, this is how I would route myself. It keeps me out of the Westchester airspace and puts me at Dowdy, which is the initial fix for the RNAV 22 at Caldwell. With no major reason not to, I went ahead and departed VFR out of Quonset and picked up a code from Providence approach for the 45-minute flight to Caldwell. Again, I apologize for the lack of audio. I didn't realize what the problem was or that there was even a problem until I got home and watched the video, but I think you get the point. I went ahead and set up cruise flight at 8,500 and started configuring the VNAV so I could be at Carmel VOR at 3,000 feet, which would give me enough time to duck under the New York class Bravo and stay out of the Danbury class Delta. The G1000 makes vertical navigation so wonderfully easy, and in addition to the programming, which is pretty intuitive, the graphical representation of the bottom of descent, the banana, really helps with peace of mind. And in keeping with my original plan, which was to make as much use of the system as possible, I set up and flew the RNAV to 22 at Caldwell. I think, ultimately, going VFR saved at least a half an hour, maybe even more. Not just in terms of routing, but also just having to gather a clearance and deal with vectors on the way out as well as in the arrival. All in all, a good decision, I think. And that capped off a very pleasant trip and show. I hope you're enjoying these videos. If you are, please hit the like button. And if you really like them, please subscribe. There's no greater motivator for me to spend the time to make these than when I see that others are enjoying them. Here's what's up next on Life in the Fast Lane.
9 Delta Alpha, your radar contact, climb and maintain
From some
4,000.
ATC and for-flight weirdness.
Yeah, you got bad routing. You can't go with that routing at flight level 280.
Okay, can you give me lower, say 200 for 9 Delta Alpha?
No, that routing is like for people going at 6,000 feet.
Okay, well, I'll take whatever you can give me to get me there. Center,
To some
Meridian
mid-September
99 Delta Alpha,
convection.
any chance for 10 to the right for the next 20 miles?
To a boisterous hippie commune on an old rock quarry in the middle of Ohio. It's another episode of Life in the Fast Lane.